Well, I finally purchased the Kindle edition of Drawn by Jesus by Leighton Flowers to read it, and since it's been about a year or so since its release, I entirely forgot it was written in response to James White's Drawn by the Father. So here I am reading and reviewing White's Drawn by the Father so I can put Flowers' book in context. And to be frank, it just doesn't feel like a fair contest here, placing these books side by side, in part because James White's book is just so short. I don't think he ever envisioned someone writing a response against it because his arguments in this book are really paper thin. And his treatment of those who disagree with him are far from exemplary. I even felt bad while reading it, knowing that I was going to review this because at the end of the chapters, I was typically just like, that's it? That's like all he wrote? But here we are, so let's go over James White's book, Drawn by the Father. Drawn by the Father was released in 2013, and based on what I could see about the publisher, I don't think they exist anymore. The book's only about 100 pages long, providing a brief overview of John 6, leading to the sections that White is intending to cover, which is verses 35 to 45. Although it's a short book, only about 80 pages when you take out the introduction and the ending, this should be more than enough to cover 10 verses, looking at just walking through these verses, verse by verse, with sound exegesis. And if you want to know a little bit more about what I thought on James White's book, Drawn by the Father, stay with me for just a few more minutes. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to understand the gospel, please subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with my current book reviews. Also, share this video with others to let them know about the books by James White. And I want to say a big thank you to the Buy Me a Coffee members, whose support allows me to cover the costs that continue to show up with Rev Reads. And if you have benefited from the channel, I would love for you to consider supporting at a beginning membership price of only $3 a month. Now, I thought White's introduction in this book was very good. I really enjoyed his explanation of the works of God in John 6, 28 and 29. The first and foremost action that must be taken by anyone who seeks to do the will of God is to believe in Jesus Christ. And that is so right. And then when he writes on hungering and thirsting after righteousness a few pages later and connects that with Jesus Christ, who is our satisfaction as the bread of life, and that he is the never-ending store of satisfaction for all who hunger and thirst, really good stuff. So White establishes well what Jesus is doing in John chapter 6, the context of it all, him using bread as another illustration of man's need to believe in Jesus for life. The only issue I had with the introductory chapter was when White writes that the Greek present tense verb refers to continuous, ongoing action. The better description should be that the present tense can refer to continuous ongoing action, because there are many places where the present tense is used that it simply doesn't refer to continuous action. If you translated all the present tense verbs in the New Testament as continuous action, you'd be like, that's a bad translation of the New Testament. We need to use the context to determine if an action is continuous. You cannot argue that an action must be continuous based on the use of the present tense alone. I then got to about page 30 of the book, and this is where I found myself pleasantly surprised with what I'd read so far. I was really in agreement with White in so many different places, and then I got to the point where I agreed with him hardly at all. He started driving me a little crazy by writing God's choice, God's will, God's sovereign purpose. It is solely God's grace that makes man to differ from another man. And that kind of language, it drives me a little crazy because I find it insanely disconnected from the overall biblical narrative. Like, was the Bible telling us the difference between Cain and Abel was that God chose Abel to offer the right sacrifice and chose Cain to offer the wrong? And then I think you can go to example after example in the Bible where God is calling on people to do right, calling on them to obedience, and God is being rejected, and they're choosing to do other than what God would have them to do. So I'm just shocked that someone who spends their whole life reading, digging through the Bible, knowing the stories of Scripture, can write something like that. The book is also filled with unproven dogmatic statements that are passed off as serious exegesis. such as when he was writing on the phrase, "All that the Father gives me will come to me." White writes, "The Father is the one who gives. His action is the primary cause. His action must be first." And there's simply nothing in the passage to back up that claim. God could give people to Jesus because they kept his word. God could give people to Jesus because they were humble in response to him. God could give people to Jesus because they were over 7 feet tall and had purple hair. So we don't have that point that he's making in the text. He then writes, "Man's actions will never determine God's decisions. God's decrees rule over the decisions of the creatures, mankind." I also found this to be a straightforward contradiction with Scripture. When Jesus is the one who teaches us, "Ask and it'll be given to you." James, the brother of Jesus, taught us, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." When Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor, and I will give you rest." Those are all passages where we have God clearly saying, if you come, if you pray, I will respond to these specific actions with promised responses. God responded to the prayers of Moses in Numbers. When God said that he would destroy Israel, Moses asked for mercy, and God responded to Moses. God consistently in the Bible humbles himself like a loving parent to a child and responds to our request. This idea that God decrees and rules over all of our decisions is foreign to the world of Jesus. Although I do appreciate that he tied the clay illustration in Romans 9 to Jeremiah chapter 18, although I didn't like that his conclusion of Paul's teaching in Romans 9 contradicted Jeremiah's teaching in Jeremiah 18. Drawn by the Father also has numerous arguments that I would put in the category of cage stage Calvinist argument that don't really defend his position but are meant to put the non-Calvinists in just a really bad light. Such as when he calls Jesus an utter failure if Jesus is calling all people to his grace and patiently waiting for them to respond, since the majority of those who are called through the gospel end up rejecting his grace. I find this a grave mischaracterization of the non-Calvinist view, and also to call Jesus passive in drawing men to his name. There's no way that Jesus is passive in the non-Calvinist view of the gospel. I also thought it was crazy to call the church that rejects election, unconditional election, to be a church that is watering down the gospel and trying to make the gospel offense-free. We don't deny unconditional election to salvation in order to boost our attendance numbers, but because we believe unconditional election isn't found in the Bible. Now, as a whole, I found this book to be lacking substantive arguments for viewing John 6 as a passage supporting the idea that God only draws those who are unconditionally elect to salvation, and all those who are drawn by him most certainly will come. I really expected a deeper and also a clearer argument for his view, because out of all the passages in the Bible, I believe the one that most clearly lends itself, or I would say could be twisted to that interpretation, especially if you ignore John 6:45, is John chapter 6. Also, if you're comfortable with Jesus telling people that the reason you can't believe me is because the Father doesn't want you to believe me, well, then I guess that's the best passage for you. But imagine using that tactic the next time you were witnessing to someone. And I still don't understand White's final point before his conclusion, when he wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that God's drawing doesn't bring men to a point where they can either believe or reject the gospel. White says that's not in harmony with verses 37 to 40. And furthermore, he says it's not consistent with the passage itself. He writes, "Note that Jesus, unless the Father draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day. All who are drawn by the Father are also raised by the Son." But Jesus never says that all who are drawn are raised. Jesus says, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day." And I'm shocked that the simple, direct understanding of this passage isn't, you can't come to the Father unless he draws you. But once he draws you, you can come. And if you come, the Son will raise you up. You see, Jesus doesn't guarantee that if the Father drew you that you would come and then be raised, but he guarantees that once you are drawn, you can come. And if you do respond with faith, you will be raised. So I don't really get where White's bringing his concluding argument from. And I'll end here. I think this has been long enough for a book of this size. Drawn by the Father, written by James White. It started out better than I expected. I would say I really liked the first third of the book approximately, but then his arguments for his view on John 6, I believe overall were lacking. And even if they had been better than I expected, the book still would have been a major negative for me on account of all the comments that he made that weren't based on an exegesis of the passage, but I feel like were more Facebook and Twitter level arguments for Calvinism. So I would say this is a great book for the cage stage Calvinists, but I'm not really sure who else this one would be good for.